This is a clip from Keith's recent visit to Cashflow Ninja, a show hosted by MC Lobsher. It's a great review of the 2021 housing supply nosedive. Don't forget to hit like. It helps the channel enormously.
I have a fantastic show for you today, joined by a returning guest, Keith Weinhold from Get Rich Education. Keith, great to see you.
MC, it's been a few years since I've been here. Thanks so much for having me back.
What have you been up to, my friend, and what are the things that you're excited about these days and on your radar?
Yeah, well, an awful lot. I've been doing a lot more media appearances, a lot more television appearances, and so on. I've been doing a lot more with video on YouTube and so on. But I've really been helping people in the very interesting market that we're in. And you know, it's funny, MC. People always talk about how times are uncertain. Even back in 2019, people were calling them uncertain times, and they had no idea what was coming at them the following year in 2020. And so much has changed in our real estate world since then. And, you know, really two things I've been helping people with, MC, and helping them wrap their head around is, number one, a housing crash is certain, an absolute 100% certainty in the near term here. And the second thing is, in these high inflationary times, like the pandemic helped fuel, you as an everyday individual investor can not only be impoverished by real estate, by inflation rather, like a lot of people are, but you can actually profit with inflation three ways at the same time with real estate. I call that the inflation triple crown. So those are two things I've really been helping people with: the housing crash and the inflation triple crown.
And I'm excited to talk about these two things with you. Let's dive into the housing crash. Why it is 100% certain. What are you seeing out there? What is this new housing market? And I know every area is different and is has its own dynamics, but what are you seeing out there in the housing?
The important thing to remember is the reason that I say a housing crash is a 100% certainty, and maybe you, the listener, the viewer, are thinking, what are you, clairvoyant or something? I mean, who really knows beyond the shred of any semblance of doubt that there's a housing crash imminent? That is because the housing crash, it already took place. It happened about 2 years ago in April of 2020. So if we back up a little bit, the pandemic wrought unprecedented changes really in how people live every day. And the short story is it increased the demand for homes. Back in 2019, a home is not too much more where a person lived and slept and recreated. With the changes that the pandemic brought, now it's also where you live and sleep and recreate, but people are more likely, with what's happened with supply chains in the world, to have their own garden or have their own greenhouse or work from home or homeschool their children. So the short story is this heightened the demand for real estate, and the supply crash that I talk about, this limited supply, that occurred in April of 2020. Now, there are a bunch of measures of the amount of available homes in the United States, but if we just look at the FRED data, the active listing count, and by the way, sometimes you might see that acronym FRED around when you look at different data. That just stands for Federal Reserve Economic Data. Over the long term, we've had 1.5 million homes available and listed on the market. We're currently below 400,000. We only have about 1/4 as much supply as what we need in order to meet this heightened demand, this heightened utility value that a home has. Utility just means usefulness. So a home is more useful. There's more demand. There's less supply. With what happened in April of 2020, that's when the housing supply failed to make its seasonal rebound. Typically in the spring, these active listings go up. It actually began to go down in April of 2020 and fall precipitously, such that it fell about 60% with the available supply of homes from April to 2020 until the present day. I mean, you talk about a crash. A lot of people consider a crash as a loss in value of more than 20%. This is a loss in supply of over 60%. So I'm really not trying to be hyperbolic when I say that the housing crash already occurred. It was a supply crash, not a price crash. No price crash is expected, in part due to the low supply. And look, a housing supply crash, that's worse than a price crash. You know, a price crash might mean, well, a homeowner's home fell, so that's only worth 80% of what they bought it for. But a supply crash is worse. We have trouble housing our own people. That increases the homelessness rate. That creates people to double up in homes and actually sacrifice their quality of life due to this low supply of housing, this housing supply crash. This is a real problem. And, you know, it's pretty remarkable, MC. Think about it. We put a man on the moon in the year 1969. But today we have trouble housing the Martinson family or the Joneses right here in our own nation, you know, people that have jobs and have income. So the short story is that the housing crash already occurred. It occurred in April of 2020, and that low supply keeps the pressure on prices. When you have a low supply, you might have 10 or 20 bidders for a home. And that's exactly the mechanism that increases prices, because when you have multiple bidders for just one available property, that's when the sale price exceeds the asking price.
The supply, not enough supply, huge demand, especially in certain markets, because there's massive migration trends. These trends were in motion prior to 2020. They were just amplified with the events of 2020. But another thing that I saw too was the amount of capital that was available. So even folks that had a primary residence were now looking at the uncertainty of the market and the stock market and all the other asset classes, and they go, well, what do I do? Maybe I just position this capital in a second home or a third home or a fourth home, right? So you had that kind of capital coming in too.
Oh, that's right. You bring up a really good point, MC. There are a few layers to this, and what helps drive this demand and continue to constrain the supply. Part of it is, you touched on it. Some people want to buy a second home, whether they use that as a vacation home or whether they use that as a rental. But the point is they're keeping their first home. They're not putting that one on the market, further constraining supply. That listing never takes place, because they got such a low mortgage interest rate. Now that interest rates are up, they know that they can't get that. So they want to keep that rate in place, further constraining supply now that we're in this environment of higher interest rates. And really another layer, and this is something that transcends the pandemic, because this occurred prior to pandemic times, but it continues to go on now, is the demographic piece. Millennials are the largest age group of the United States, even bigger than the baby boomers. And within the millennials, those in their mid to late 30s are the most populous cohort in the entire nation. Well, those people in their mid to late 30s, they're in what demographers call prime household formation years. Whether those people want to rent or whether those people want to own, they just want to be independent. They want to be out of the house. That's part of what's really pushing this demand, is demographics that are coming from millennials. So it's not completely supply and demand, but that is most of the piece. That's why demand is expected to continue to be high and supply low, continuing to put that pressure on prices.